what those organizations should do, what's their role in that world, and then on a very practical level, how they go about doing that.
Keen to also understand where the moments of friction been and how have you overcome them?
And I think there's a big difference between telling someone something and persuading someone of something. And I think the latter involves a bit of listening.
And it goes beyond that kind of vision, because you can have a North Star and then you can leave, and you can leave the room and everyone can have 10 different interpretations of what that means or how you get there. So you need to broaden it out.
Every child, no matter their background, should have a fair shot at life, and the education system was an important enabler of that.
What would be some of the tips in terms of effective storytelling? In an era of radical transparency, businesses and activists can sometimes be locked into shouting matches. But what happens when businesses and activists bridge those divides? Lewis Iwu, a former world debating champion, and Barry, an advocate strategist, have built their careers on one premise. If you really want to change the world, then you have to be able to work with others and build out a coalition. Today, we explore how these two masters of persuasions have worked with global brands to find their voice and also their social soul. Lewis, Barry, thank you so much for your time and joining the Unlikely Alliance podcast. So I want to take you both back to your late teens, early 20s, and want to reflect on what was a pivotal moment for both your lives. Lewis, I'll start off with you. You grew up in London. It's Newham, I understand, and it's fair to say Newham has a distinct character, a vibrancy. I wanted to, and it's probably fair to say it's a slightly different character to the halls of Oxford. I wanted to get a sense, walking the halls of Oxford first time, what did you feel? How did you feel, and how did that impact your journey?
Yeah, it was quite different, as you've highlighted. I mean, Newham's great because what I loved about Newham growing up was it was diverse. I walked to school, you walk past the mosque, several churches, lots of denominations. There were sort of people with families, there were young people. It just felt very rich, and you assume that's how the rest of the world is. And yeah, University of Oxford was a bit different. It wasn't as diverse, but I think what you work out pretty quickly is you can get on with quite a lot of people. And in Newham, we pride ourselves at being sociable and friendly, and we can mix with anyone, and sort of brought that attitude and mentality to university, I think.
Yeah, and I like that. It's that sense of bringing that attitude, and certainly what's interesting, I imagine, from that is it led you to participate in debating as well.
Yeah.
What was that like? Because I'm sure you would have met people from different backgrounds and part of different discussions there as well.
Yeah, and I started debating when I was in year 9, so pretty young, about 15 years old. And it continued at university. And the great thing about it is you meet people from a wide range of backgrounds, people who go to private schools, people who come from completely different political backgrounds, people who've lived very different lives. And you shout at each other for a while, you argue, and then afterwards you shake hands and you become friends. And even today, some of my closest friends are people I met through doing the activity. And I guess that was my first real experience of trying to see the sort of the benefit of having people who see the world differently kind of coming together, trying to create something. Admittedly, it was a debate, but it could be applied in other scenarios. And then realize you can be friends afterwards. So I got that. I was lucky to have that at a really young age, and almost certainly the most important thing that happened to me at my life at that stage of my life.
Well, yeah, and that's a really important point. We're going to come back to that point of taking on different points of views. But Barry, I wanted to reflect on your journey. So, you grew up in Ireland, and you've had 3 bites of the cherry of moving over to London. But we'll talk about one of the most formative ones, which was moving over to university. How was that like for you? And both from a university perspective, but also a new city, a new environment.
Yeah, I mean, different to Lewis. I came from small town Ireland, a lovely town, a great town, informed a lot of who I am, but not a cultural melting pot. It was a town where you knew most people. Everyone knew my parents and the family. So the biggest thing coming to London was, the diversity, the scale, but it was the anonymity. It was that sense of you can probably recreate who you want to be here if you want to. but also a sense that could lead very quickly to loneliness and isolation. And so for me, it was about trying to get a sense of how you capture that balance, and how you kind of throw yourself into a new city like London, maintain a bit of your identity from home, not lose that connection, but also use it as an opportunity to go on and kind of explore new bits of your personality, of your talents, and also to meet like a different group of people. My university class that I went into, it was Birkbeck. So I came over as what they used to call the baby students. Birkbeck's a lifelong learning college.
Yeah.
And the guys in my class immediately were an ex, dub this one out. The guys in my class were an ex-convict, a woman who'd run a business in the Middle East, and someone from Latin America from a Venezuelan family. So, immediately thrown into something new, learning very, very different perspectives and approaches.
I always find that people who have those cross-generational experiences, it is very formative in terms of how they approach. And if I know we'll go on to your career in terms of advocacy and also in terms of Purpose Union, but how do you feel that cross-generational experience has helped in terms of your subsequent career?
Yeah, I traced that a little bit back. Like I grew up a lot around older people. My dad is a great person for, he used to hang out with the owl lads when he was growing up, full of stories, full of kind of folk wisdom. And I think immersing yourself, not losing your sight of that kind of perspective is important. And then that was kind of helped then when I became an uncle. And for the first time, you start to feel like there's a generation coming up behind you. So you have this, you play a role, a kind of a link in a chain. And for the first time, you start to feel like you have responsibilities for what's coming after you. And that informs a lot of what we ended up doing at Purpose Union. We have this phrase, the work we do, we want to leave a place in a better state than we found it. More people adopted that right now, we might be in a better state than we are.
I 100% agree. And that's probably a good point to almost fast forward a little bit to present day. And if you both humor me for a second. So if we strip away the title, strip away the accolades, because I know Purpose Union has done so much and been recognized for so much, what's it that you actually do and why does it really matter to you?
I mean, I'm still trying to explain that one.
No, it's a great question. I mean, at its core, we help organizations think about how to make sense of the world that we're in, what those organizations should do, what's their role in that world, and then on a very practical level, how they go about doing that. And that can be sort of a large business, it could be a startup, it could be an advocacy organization, it could be a group of philanthropists, it could be a group of funders, it could be a coalition of all of the above. And we can talk later about some of the work we're doing in that category. But at its core, we, to Barry's point, felt that actually there was a generation of people who felt passionately about the role of business and charities and the public sector working together to solve problems. Problems aren't getting smaller. They're piling up a bit. And that actually, if we could bring together some really interesting creative thinkers who were diverse, that was a big part of why we set Purpose Union up, then maybe we can help them help the world. And that's kind of where we started from.
Thank you. And we're going to explore much of that, particularly the coalition building. I think that's really important. And so, Barry, why does it matter to you? Why does it matter to you both in terms of the work of Purpose Union?
Well, I can remember the first time that we sat down and properly sketched out what we thought Purpose Union would be like. Lewis had already been having conversations with Daniella, was the other co-founder. We were both at the UN General Assembly in New York. It happens every September. It's a weird thing where, I think I met you there. Yeah. You have politicians, you have celebrities, you have philanthropists all coming together, mostly with a common and shared agenda to try and better, whether it's health, inequality, climate, etc. I was there on my charity pass. Lewis was there with some big bad corporate clients, I'm sure. And we sat down towards the end of the week, reflecting on the kind of different experiences we had, and we found that though we were sitting in different rooms, very often with different stakeholders, actually the conversations that we were having were pretty much the same. There is a set of issues here which are going to grow and increase in their severity across this was 2018, 2019, the decade ahead as we saw it: climate change, inequality, diversity, racial injustice, the big gaps between the North and South, which are only growing. And we found that, or we felt that there was going to be a new generation of leaders who wanted to approach that differently, and who wanted to, alongside earning a living, delivering good results, or setting up a business, they wanted to also feel like that work had some level of purpose and mission. And that was kind of the real animating conversation. We spent a couple of months after that talking about what that would look like. But for me, it was a big jump. Lewis had been working in agencies before, in and out of it. I came from straight down the line, nonprofit comms, really know what an agency was at the time. And so I needed to be able to do it in a way that I thought I could still do that kind of mission-led work. And that's kind of what we went down to found with Purpose Union then. So we do the kind of advisory work, we do the kind of sitting alongside clients to think through really big, high-stakes issues, but we do it from a position that's really rooted in our own individual experiences, the diversity of our team, and always with an eye on social or environmental impact. And
I can imagine how both important but also challenging that is. And just reflecting on, and Barry, you've talked about this as well, it's probably fair to say you both come from different experiences and bring different skills to your work. It's probably fair to say. And I think just reflecting on both of your journeys, actually, it's almost how you've come about to Purpose Union. So in terms of developing debates and developing arguments, you've had that structure, that environment of debating and everything that goes along with it. And Barry, you've had that messy kind of advocacy, but important and making that case for the argument. How have you learned from each other in terms of the work of Purpose Union, but also keen to also understand where the moments of friction been and how have you overcome them?
I don't think there are huge numbers of friction. It's interesting because my
go on there, Johnston.
My background is primarily working with business and corporates, and there is a pace to which some businesses work. There are different concepts you apply a bit, and actually, what's been very helpful working with Barry for the past 8 years is having access to a whole range of tools about how sort of nonprofits think about impact and really focusing on impact. I think maybe perhaps in my previous roles in previous agencies, we thought about impact, but it was kind of, we said the word impact. We didn't really, I'm not sure we thought about it deeply, or at the very least, we were talking about impact at a reputation level, which is important, or at a sort of bottom line level. I think what Barry has introduced to us all is a very sophisticated way of thinking about social impact, which ironically enough actually makes it more likely you get the reputational and the financial impact as well. Areas of tension, I don't think there are many. I mean, we've had a couple of clients.
There must be some.
We have a couple of clients where we have we may have slightly different opinions as to whether or not we would work with them. We've got a framework in terms of how we decide what types of industries we work for. We're pretty clear on that, and there are some borderline cases where I think we've had a robust debate. But I think that's fine as well.
Should I ask why I'm asking that? So why, particularly that point, is because there will be people who are listening and watching who will want to embark on a similar journey and will want to. I think the big question in their mind is, when I have a disagreement, how do I handle it? And what I guess would be interesting to understand is how is the tools that you've developed to be able, and you've talked about the framework, which is it's a really good way of being able to do that. But also, are there any other things that you've developed along the journey to be able to? I wouldn't say disagreements, but as you say, a differing of opinion of how to achieve the same goal, basically.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on that, and Barry will have his view. I think for us, we wanted to create a culture where people felt comfortable debating. Look, the issues we work on, which range from climate change to racial justice to education inequality to biodiversity to community cohesion, there are, of course, lots of different ways in which you can analyze the problem and different solutions for that. And even with our own team, we'll have different opinions. I think we've created a culture, I think, where people are free to kind of debate that. Every morning, we look at what's happening in the world, in the news. We have a debate every morning about the big issues of the day. In our teams, we don't really have a hierarchy. Of course, we've got formal titles, etc. But we don't have a rule which says in meetings with clients or internal meetings, you have to wait your turn or certain people can speak. Actually, there is inequality. Like in debating, something we picked up from debating, everyone has equal speaking time, etc. Now, of course, there's going to be a decision made, etc. But at the end of the day, I know we've made better decisions because we've had an open environment where the team has fed into it. I don't know, Barry, your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think areas where there's been tension is I think Lewis has a certain amount more certainty than I do. He's quicker to make up his mind and then he's sure of his convictions. I can be a little bit more on the one hand, this and maybe that. I look after the accounts, so it's probably better that way. But yeah, I mean, I think probably only ever around pace and speed has been where there's been issues where we've kind of thought, hang on. And I've learned a huge amount around debating. My music taste has probably improved a little bit.
I'm not sure about that.
Your fault.
I feel like I want to explore that a little bit more.
But that again, coming from a non-profit background, there's quite a lot of groupthink in those organizations, and you come from a perspective whereby most people agree broadly on what needs to happen. I mean, I've seen some of the most vicious fights I've seen, and I've been in NGOs as well, but probably around different things. But the ability to throw out and actually kind of enjoy an argument is quite useful. I think we almost complement one another in that regard. And indeed, actually with Danny as a trio, when we started the business, quite complementary in that generally Lewis tended to be more gung-ho. I was a bit more on the cautious side and Danny came somewhere in the middle. So it's about balance. And it's also been about being able to, if there ever has been those moments of tension, there have been one or two, one or other person will send a text message that evening, defusing everything. So, and I think probably the final thing is we quite enjoy the work and we have a sense of perspective on it. It's important, it's very valuable, and it's quite rewarding work. But we are not on the front line of humanitarian response. We are not in a surgeon's theater. And so when you need to be able to take that step back and think, you know what, that was a bit of a silly fight. We'll figure this one out.
And that's really helpful for listeners and to hear. And from my perspective, what's been really admirable to kind of see from Purpose Union between both of you and Danny as well is an ability to draw on your different skill set. And I'm an outsider, but observing it's been really, really good to see. And so it's really interesting to see that you also operate within that environment internally as well. And I think that's really important. I wanted to pick up on the discussion around coalition building and reflect on something I know you've both reflected on and you've both commented on in previous interviews you've given and also previous statements you've said, which is the importance of building a coalition and almost a coalition of will. And I believe, Lewis, you've kind of particularly remarked on this. And so I'll ask you both, but I'll start with Lewis and Barry. I would also want to hear from you, particularly on another point as well, is how do you build an argument that actually persuades people? Because we've had the opportunity and we've been fortunate enough to speak to business leaders, to speak to politicians, to speak to charity sector as well. And there is no shortage of people wanting to build coalitions. People want to do it. I think the issue a lot of the time is how do you convince people to join that coalition? And how do you broaden out the tent? And I know you both have a wealth of experience there, but
yeah, I mean, take that in two parts. I think the first on the argument point is, there's a science behind good arguments. And, we have a program which we've worked with a wide range of organizations, the Labour Party to Imperial University, on helping people understand how you layer arguments, how you frame arguments, how you sort of ensure that arguments meet people where they are. And I would say the massive, if you look at the big difference between people who are really good at this and people who maybe aren't as good, is I think people are able to sort of still make the arguments they want to make, but understand how it kind of connects to and meets the needs and expectations of the people they listen to. And I think there's a big difference between telling someone something and persuading someone of something. And I think the latter involves a bit of listening. The final thing I'd say in terms of coalition building, and I spent 4 years running an education coalition, which had some unlikely partners in it. It had, investment banks in it. It had trade unions in it. It had grassroots organizations, and it had some of the biggest charities in the country in it. And I think what worked, even though they all had separate interests, was that there was a commonality of interest that they could all agree on. And we agreed to park maybe some of the other fights that we could have, but all of them cared in particular about the idea that every child, no matter their background, should have a fair shot at life, and the education system was an important enabler of that. And that was the thing that we always came back to. So I think in terms of building coalitions, you just have to keep people focused on that end goal, park the other conversations, and focus on what's the argument that's going to make sure that we can hold this coalition, even through dark times. And I think there's a science behind that.
I really like the point around listening. That often is the most difficult skill to have, because it is so tempting to come in, particularly if you have a strong view. And Barry, I'll look to you on this, because there is, you talked about groupthink within the NGO world. Having worked in there, I can identify with that as well. And in some cases, there is a question: why do you feel progressives sometimes are not as good as making the case, particularly in recent times, in terms of building that wider coalition? Or do you feel actually they are very good?
I think you probably see it at two layers. I think there are just really structural barriers to progressives making and having their arguments heard because of media ownership, et cetera, et cetera. But that's historic. It's been there ever thus. I do think something which is increasing is that you're seeing identity and coalitions overlap in ways that they probably haven't historically. That has been a bit of a change. And like I said earlier, some of the most vicious fights I've seen have been within coalitions and alliances, that kind of small p politics. What we spend an awful lot of time doing at the start of any kind of new alliance or partnership is finding a common story that you can tell. And it goes beyond that kind of vision, because you can have a North Star and then you can leave a goal, and you can leave the room and everyone can have 10 different interpretations of what that means or how you get there. So you need to broaden it out. And you need to be able to have a shared story that you tell about yourselves, which ultimately is, whether that's your family or your school or your village or your football team, it's kind of how you create community. We call these purpose narratives, and we invest an awful lot of time in developing them. Sometimes clients are a bit like, why are we doing this again? But it bears the test of time then, because it means you have a kind of shared grammar or language to understand your mission together. It means that you have a point of reference back when you're trying to square arguments, and teaching people how to argue well is another thing that's really important in building coalitions. I've seen places where that doesn't happen, and it tears them apart, and it is a skill. But yeah, we go back to that sense of not running away from identity, but creating shared identities. And you do that really, as we ever have through history, through kind of building really compelling stories that people want to be a part of.
I also think Barry's absolutely right. Those compelling stories are so important, and in many ways can sort of break away some of the barriers that may exist. I mean, two very quick ones in particular that I think spring to mind that I've been involved in. One was at the Fair Education Alliance, when the government were planning on expanding grammar schools. We were able to quickly mobilize people and add to the coalition because there was a clear common threat. There was a story that we told about the impact this was going to have on children who are disadvantaged. And that story, we focused on building a narrative, really hooked people, and it really mobilized people. It's never like a good crisis to do that. And I think the second is something that we worked on at Purpose Union, was after the Super League. It's a bit of a niche football story, but after the sort of Super League attempt to form a breakaway league in football, we were able to work with Gary Neville, Gary Lineker, about 40 footballers, and also others to kind of galvanize them around a story about, your football club or your local community kind of being sort of stolen by greed. And that was really powerful. We got 100,000 people signing a petition in Parliament that triggered a debate. We then got sort of polling, which sort of mobilized people around the idea. And ultimately, it's led to the creation of the Independent Football Regulator, which we helped to navigate. So I think the storytelling, both positive but also in a crisis, can be very powerful ways of getting that coalition and getting unlikely people to come together to work towards a common good.
One thing to add on that, and I think this is, I'm going to make an AI point because nobody said anything about AI yet. I do think this is becoming increasingly important because if you look at kind of social movements over the years, they had a tone of voice. They had figureheads and recognizable people at the front of them, but they had a bit of a tone of voice. And one of the things which was already happening, I think, certainly in progressive politics amongst nonprofits and campaigning organizations, was everyone was kind of merging towards this same slightly earnest voice. Everything was a crisis. We needed to stand with everybody. And if you're kind of starting to meld into that, it all just becomes background noise. So we spend quite a lot of time as well trying to find out what the tone of voice, what the distinctiveness is. That's going to be even more important moving into a world where everything's starting to sound the same with AI, and you just get this kind of regression towards the mean of language. And you need to be careful with this because there are charismatic, distinctive voices on opposing sides of the arguments too. But I do think there's been some kind of accident of history, perhaps, whereby we really are missing those distinctive voices on the left. You're starting to see some people come through now and pick up on this Mondani, Polanski, etc. So I do think that we've been a little bit too comfortable just in comms on the progressive side, and certainly in professionalized charity. And we've not worked hard enough. You need to earn, more than ever, you need to earn people's attention, given the way people are distracted. And that's harder. And it means probably not every campaign is going to succeed to the extent that it might have done when it had a captive audience 10, 15 years ago.
I absolutely agree with that point. And we're going to come back to that in a second. But without asking for free advice, consultancy advice.
I thought we were billing for this.
Happens all the time.
Just a note, I've got my pen and paper out as well. What would be some of the tips in terms of effective storytelling? And particularly, you talked about the need to have those distinct voices. What are some, from your experience, what are some of the tips if somebody's listening, watching, and they want to be able to have their own distinct voice? What are some of the things they should be looking out for?
Read.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And we're doing less and less of it. Before sitting down to put pen to paper or finger to keyboard is reading. And we have our methods through which we're not telling you about. Through which we put narratives and campaigns together, do a lot of workshopping. So we draw on the material that people bring, and they'll provide points of reference. But then you got to go and read. You got to see what's worked before, and then you got to reassemble that. I describe it a little bit like sculpting. You got all this material, just like so much. Often we'll do polling and insights work. You'll have interviews and stakeholders, and then you got to take that massive material and start to carve a story out of it. But the first thing you need to do is you start reading. And I think there's loads and loads of evidence coming out now about how we should be quite worried about how our brains are being rewired by the lack of reading. That's point one. You can do point two.
Yeah, I mean, I think another tip, which I think is very useful, is we use this a lot in our work on storytelling, is we're big believers in framing, in values framing, and almost every social and environmental issue can be framed around one of 7 kind of themes. They range from freedom to security to the economy to moral disgust to loyalty to tradition and history, and to fairness and justice. And the trick is being able to understand and listen and think about who are the people I'm really trying to persuade, and be very focused on that, and think about kind of what moves them. Because actually people often change their mind on particular policy issues. They don't change their values. And I think what happens sometimes is that people kind of focus a lot on, I'm going to focus on this technical bit of policy making and try and get people to move. And sometimes the underlying value gets buried or hidden. So play with that value, find it, reframe your policy agenda towards it. And I think you stand a winning chance. It's more complicated than that, of course, because what happens if you've got multiple different audiences who have different value sets. But I think that's an important starting place.
I like that frame, and I like the idea of reading. I've there are too many books on my shelf that just have not been read. They have not been read.
The first half you can say you read it. Just to pick up on Lewis's last point, there is something which, again, I think is kind of crept into certainly professionalized advocacy work over the last 10 or 15 years, is this obsession with breaking down audiences. And we get it, and it's important. We do a lot of work with More in Common, who have great data and insights on that. But I always get reminded of, I think it's an Anna Wintour quote, which is, read all the market insights information anyway, and then go with your gut. And I think that kind of courage of conviction for your arguments, to put something out there, adapt it as it goes. And that kind of, I spent some time working at Christian Aid to talk about prophetic voice. It's that ability to really have an authentic and occasionally quite provocative voice, and not be too worried about, well, does this sound right in this context, or this sound? Because ultimately, if you want to, almost by definition, win an argument, you got to bring the majority with you, which means that you have to have a narrative or story that can at least stretch across 51% of the population.
I like that. So read, know your values, and go with your gut. I've taken notes down for all of that. What I wanted to quote Mike Tyson, actually. I don't often get to quote Mike Tyson, so I'm going to admit this. And you quite, his quote was, everybody has a plan till they get punched in the face. And, the view is that, in terms of creating arguments, is, there's been importance over the last 10 to 20 years of actually a steady progressive trail in terms of actually, broadly over the last 30 years, you would say actually this generation, parents' generation, their children's generation has been better than parents. It's probably fair to say over the last few years, the metaphorical punch in the face has happened, whether it be the anti-woke agenda, whether it be the response to Me Too, the response to Black Lives Matters, the manosphere, and it's probably fair to say the business world hasn't been exempt. Whether you see McDonald's, which is scaled back on DEI policy, whether you see other brands like Walmart, Amazon, who have also scaled back on policies and also messaging, and Boeing, who've kind of rolled in their DEI to HR. So it begs a simple question: is the world of purpose-driven business over?
I think no. No is a short answer. Agreed. Three things that I think are important to consider. One is, look, I think the media hype has obviously sort of dominated how people think about this. The reality is, and this is borne out by the companies we work with and talk to and sit around tables alongside, is that they're still doing the work. You hear about the big organizations who are scaling back a bit, but actually most organizations are still doing this work. So I think it's important to have that corrective to the narrative. I think the second is, what's interesting is if you look at the Harris poll, for example, that comes out regularly in the US, very trusted. Last year, their analysis showed that the companies that maintained their DEI commitments were the only ones who saw a reputation boost last year amongst consumers, right? And that tallies with anecdotal evidence we know from Target, for example, that shows footfall has increased. They've won customers from some of their competitors who've moved behind. The third, and I think this is incredibly important, is if you think about some of the big challenges that are coming down the line or are getting louder and louder, whether it's climate, whether it's social disorder, whether it is poverty and a growing inequality, whether it's the social impact of AI. These are all things that will impact how businesses succeed. They affect people, they affect the planet, they affect our ecosystem. So for me, it is at the same time where governments are struggling to kind of respond to some of this work, and at the same time where consumers expect businesses to have a response to some of these challenges, the logical conclusion is that businesses are going to have an answer to this, right? And they're going to have to think. Now, do they have to think more? Do they have to think in a way that's a bit more complex? Because the world is more complex, of course. Do they have to, and I think this is crucial, do they have to understand that rather than seeing this as a standalone silo, it is integrated into their strategy and the way they communicate and the way they engage with investors and their political stakeholders, of course. So this is not us saying the way in which this agenda is going to be like it was 10 years ago. It is obviously changing, but some of it is good change. But I would move away from the headlines and focus on what's happening on the ground, which is that businesses know they've got to show up on these issues.
I like that.
I always had a problem with the Mike Tyson quote, because what does he think was going to happen in the boxing ring? Like, you're going to get hit, punched in the face. Like, he was good, but he was going to get punched in the face at some stage. So he should have had a plan for that. And we've seen, it's easy to be wise after the fact, but we've sat alongside clients or watched from outside other organizations and said, this is going to happen and you're not ready for it. And where we are now in the climate crisis, as long as you in any way accept the science, is entirely predictable. Invasions of Ukraine and COVID aside, even ahead of Brexit, there was a dominant narrative, but there was very clear signals that it could go the way that it went. And so actually, I think one of the things that we're increasingly seeing now is businesses particularly, but this is happening for large philanthropies as well, is they're becoming much more interested in sense-making and horizon scanning in a way that they should have been before, frankly. And so we spend more of our time now, much more noticeably, helping people slightly look around the corners and see what's coming, because they did get tripped up by what happened. A great example was the response, or lack of really, to the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade in the United States. And lots of business people, probably unsurprisingly mostly led by men, fair enough, totally flat-footed in terms of what their employees, for example, wanted to hear and see from them as leaders at that time. And so we think that there is a lack of leadership there, and it's an absence that we desperately need to fill. And we've been very, very lucky that the clients that we work with have actually decided to stay in those spaces. Maybe we chose the clients well, maybe they've been well advised, but it means that the work continues. And even if you look at something like climate change, the money is all going in that direction. So we have this kind of, certainly a high level kind of reaction to it now, but we've always had pendulum swings in these kind of conversations. We did work out in the States last year for New York Climate Week. One of the ex-Biden officials there talked about that pendulum that always swings between administrations, even on things like environmental regulation and climate change. We've had probably the biggest pendulum swing that we've seen in a long time, quite well organized from the right in American politics. But we can already start to feel that pendulum is coming back. And the question is, do we wait for it to come back, or do we set up mechanisms, arguments that either push or pull that pendulum back quicker? And it's meant, and this is where I think the left and progressive campaigners need a bit more courage of the convictions, a bit more motivation. It means we are going to have to re-win some arguments that we thought we'd settled. But that's always been the case.
Yeah. And just to pick up on that, it's reflecting both progressives in a wider sense. What do you see as some of the mistakes or biggest mistakes that have happened in the last year? And I think it's important just if you don't analyze the mistakes, you can't necessarily move forward. So what would you see as the biggest mistakes, particularly for people who may want to embark on a similar journey to look out for?
I was always struck. There was a story. There's a company which will remain nameless. I presented to their board, their leadership team, giving them an overview of the landscape for diversity and inclusion, and what it meant, how it tied to their corporate strategy and goals, and why the two can be married together. And afterwards, someone came up to me. This man came up to me, and he tapped me on the shoulder. And he said, "That was a great presentation. Thank you. I grew up in Liverpool, poor family. I kind of climbed my way up and ended up in a space like this. And for the first time in my life, I saw me in this DEI story. So he hadn't, for the years that the organization talks about diversity and inclusion, hadn't seen himself in that. And it just required us framing things differently for him to go, oh, okay, this obviously makes sense. And obviously, if it's about me who's been mocked for my accent or my career, yeah, this is something I care about. So I think one of the big mistakes is I think there's been and it's understandable, but I think on a range of issues, but let's look at DEI in particular, because it's bearing the brunt of a lot of focus, on taking language which has primarily come from academia, good concepts which have come from academia, but there hasn't been an attempt to filter or think about what is the persuasion job that we're trying to do. And I think what lots of organizations have done is they've taken that, they've imposed it on an organization without winning hearts and minds. Because it's easier to have a PowerPoint presentation that says DEI strategy and send an email around than to actually have dialogues internally about what this is and how people feel. So I think one of the big mistakes is that we've separated communications and persuasion from the technical art of doing important DI work. There's a healthy debate because some people will say the two should be separated, they're different, etc. I think we've seen the consequences of that. So I think that has been a major part of it. But I think the second, and I think we might explore this in a moment, is one of the things that gives me, Barry mentioned earlier on, I'm very optimistic usually. One of the things that gives me hope about a lot of what we're seeing today is people can be persuaded on a lot of things. People change their mind all the time, right? We've seen throughout history, various issues, the public have moved. And maybe on some issues today, they're moving in directions we didn't anticipate. But I think one of the interesting questions is, who is going to where people are, right? Because I've come this morning from an event in Westminster. Yesterday, Barry and I were at an event in Westminster. I think progressives and people who care about this agenda are very good at convening particular groups of people in particular spaces. But who's actually going to have this conversation with the public, right? And I think the spaces in which people now exist in online, where sports podcasts, for example, or in their barbershop or in the pub, there are people who are present there, but it's not progressives. And I think one of the things we're going to think about and discuss, and we're already talking to campaigns about this, is we have to be more creative about where we show up.
I 100% agree with that. I listened to something the other day, actually. It was talking about podcasts in the US, and obviously everybody's listening to the Unlikely Alliance, so that's a given. But it was saying that
there now.
It was saying that the 10 largest, the 10 largest podcasts in the US are all right-leaning, and it's because they've been very deliberate in terms of harness the medium, but also in terms of having discussions with people in places that you would not ordinarily assume and see as well. So definitely something to reflect upon, and I 100% agree. I've got a couple of, I'll say, quick fire questions. Not so quick. You can elaborate though. Which social issue do you think would not necessarily immediately be solved, but would be solved very quickly if business and activists were able to work together on this? And there'll be significant movement in the next tomorrow if there was concerted effort from big business and also activists. It's almost what big issue do you feel would be able to be resolved immediately in that case?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're nearly there. Aside from some bad faith actors, there's very little between the mainstream of business, long-term ESG funds, and activist base on kind of nuclear or fossil fuel non-proliferation. There's a very clear business case for leaving what's currently undiscovered in the ground. Technology and the pace of change around things like renewables far outstripping even the most optimistic cases. When the IEA, International Energy Agency, came up with its 2050 model. Now, there's huge vested interests in keeping pumping oil, and there's some very useful idiots, frankly, who are lining up alongside that and making the case for it. I think business and activists are strongly aligned there. We'll go back to some of the points I made earlier about the power and the structural hold over the media. But if you look at some of the movement that's happened there, and one of the things that really frustrates me is this country is the global success story for that. In terms of how we've been able to decarbonize the economy, that is a model that you would want to choose. And I don't buy a lot of the analysis and the arguments that I've seen, because it's coming, I think, from bad faith positions. So I think if we were to have a little bit less sniffiness between those two constituencies, big business and activists, then I think we could certainly get back on the front foot. And unmistakably, we need to bring the US back in again. There's a couple of other places where the support has softened. But there's a ticking clock. There's an imperative, very strong business case there that we can absolutely win and win very quickly.
I like that. Sniffiness says everything you want it to say, all in one word. I'm going to use that again. Lewis?
I think there are bits of the social mobility agenda which I think we have historically done very well on. We've lost that over the last 10, 15 years, and I think we can get back on track. There are cold spots in the country where there are no businesses or employers working together with young people in schools in order to match people to opportunity. I was a beneficiary of living in Newham right when Canary Wharf was being developed, showing my age, but also making sure that businesses were coming to our school all the time. And I think, yes, we lived in East London, which at the time was a thriving, growing part of the country. How do you spread that? So I think there is something about businesses, government, schools, and organizations that work with young people working together to address that problem and get us back to, sort of the London Challenge days where we were able to sort of make real gains. So I think that's an issue where I think with some concerted effort, we can make a long inroad into sort of the problem of NEETs today.
Thank you, and thank you both. For me, three things stand out from today's discussion. So firstly, that the importance, I call it productive friction, because it's very much demonstrates from the conversation is that having different ideas and bringing different experience and different approaches to conversations and work is so important in terms of making sure that you're more than a sum of your parts, but then also you bring a fresh approach to things. And so that really it jumped out from this conversation, but also it's jumped out from your experience as well. The coalition of the willing and building that coalition of the willing. And, I think it's been really interesting to hear from you both about the fact that actually, in some cases, building out that coalition of the willing in previous years, more could always be looked at in terms of how do you frame it in such a way that everyone feels part of it, or the tent is wider in that sense. That's really important. And then the final point, and I think, Barry, you touched on this particularly as well, which is that level of having courage of conviction of your arguments. And sometimes, I wouldn't say progressives could be apologetic, but I think it's important to always feel that there is the courage of the argument and reflecting on that point, Lewis, that you made just at the end in terms of going to spaces and making that argument, which doesn't ordinarily associate with building out wider coalitions. Thank you both. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. I've got one final question. I know it's the question you've all been waiting for, which is, in the last season, we had a final question of each episode was basically more of a light-hearted question, which was broadly based on the fact that if you were in a karaoke, what would be your unlikely alliance song? And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to sing in this occasion. However, in this season, what we're asking is, we are on this set of Unlikely Alliance, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And so who would be your unlikely phone a friend? If you were posed the question, you want to set up a new social campaign, a new idea, who would be that likely friend that you would call? And they could be a celebrity, they could be past and present. You've got the entirety of the human race to be able to draw on. So no pressure. And it would be good if you can explain why they would be an unlikely friend. I'm looking nervously at both of you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Take it to music, because we hinted at music earlier on. And I believe in the power of music to kind of bring people together.
I like that.
To unite us when we feel a bit
So who would you do a
divided.
duet with?
I wouldn't do a duet, but I would think of a musical event, like a festival to put on with Taylor Swift. Because Taylor Swift, I have huge admiration for her. Not necessarily my music tastes, so a bit different musically, much more of a house techno head. But I think actually we can combine crowds and kind of vibes. You could create something really, really interesting. So yeah, it's a bit different. And Taylor Swift has been political.
Yes.
So I think Taylor Swift would be my unlikely business idea partner.
I like that. You've picked somebody who will undoubtedly bring all the crowds. So you don't have to do much.
I'm bringing something to the table. I hope.
I am rapidly changing my answer. I didn't know we could pick dead people as well.
Yeah. Of all the entirety of the human race, as long as you're not going to be critical of them.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'd go like old school.
Okay.
I think like one of those very, very early philosophers who sat in a town square and got people around, like Socrates or Plato.
Oh, wow.
Epicurus is my guy, that guy. He once said, bring me some cheese so I can have a feast when I please. Like nice simplicity, bringing people together and just thinking about ideas in a quite informal, relaxed way. And then we'd all have some wine and go to the concert.
I like that. So we've got cheese and a concert. It's brilliant. Thank you so much, Lewis and Barry. I really enjoyed today's conversation. And undoubtedly, Purpose Union and both of you individually are bringing people together to meet some of the biggest challenges. So thank you for that. And thank you for your time.
No, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Fun.
Cheers. And that's it. To our listeners, perhaps the person who you disagree with might be the person who provides the final piece to the puzzle on your business or social idea or campaign, and indeed might be your unlikely alliance. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share with a colleague. My name is Johnston Situ, and this is an Unlikely Alliance podcast.